Hello and welcome to Cruising Through History with Scott Cruz. My name is Xander. Scott, what are we cruising through today?
Well, today, Xander, I'm going to talk about the assassination of James Garfield.
Okay, not the assassination we usually talk about,
No,
but okay.
it's an interesting thing. He was the 20th president, and he only was in office for about 4 or 5 months until he was shot.
Wow.
And the reason that his assassination is interesting, well, I hate to say that for an assassination, but the reason it's important is because many argue, even at the time, that his medical care is what killed him and not the actual shot
Really?
that the assassin took, yes.
How do you argue the difference between medical care and a bullet?
Well, what happened was when he was shot by a man named Charles Guiteau.
Okay.
And this man was clearly insane. He had all these delusions of grandeur. He was a failed office seeker, basically. He thought that he had helped Garfield win the presidency, and he wanted to be rewarded for this.
Okay.
And where this all comes out of is there was at the time, so this would have been 1880 when he was elected. So at the time, there was a split in the Republican Party between what were called stalwarts, I think I've got that right, who were the ones who agreed and who they thought they wanted the spoil system. They didn't want civil service reform, which all of this sort of was around. And the second part of the other half of the Republican Party were called half-breeds, which I know we don't use that phrase
wow.
today. But they were called that, and they were the ones who were in favor of civil service reform and not doing the spoils system.
And let's give a little more context on the time period, because this is post-Civil War.
Yes.
But before pre-Jim Crow. I forgot what this age was called.
Well, it was Reconstruction was ended in 1876 with the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, who was actually not very popular, even though he agreed to end Reconstruction in 1876 in order to win the presidency. He had run against a person named Samuel Tilden at the time, and this was actually decided in Congress because it was so close and it was tied, and there were accusations of voter fraud in Florida, of all places, of course.
Some things
even
never
then,
change.
yes, even then, Florida played a part in that, like it did in 2000. So. But he wasn't very popular, and he was a Republican, and he decided he was not going to run again. And so this opened the field for all these. And the ironic thing about all this is Garfield, when he went to the convention, he wasn't even thinking of being president. There were 3 candidates. Ulysses Grant was one of them, and if he would have been successfully elected, he would have been the first president to serve 3 terms instead of Franklin Roosevelt.
Oh, it wasn't set at that point, was it?
No, it was just because Washington had sort of done it as a tradition. He did it so it became a tradition because you didn't want to upstage Washington, even down the line. And I don't think that's what Franklin Roosevelt was doing, but I'm just saying that at the time the tradition was you only serve 2 terms. Now, in Grant's case, they would have been non-consecutive because you had Hayes in the middle there. And so there were a couple of other candidates. James Blaine was another one who ended up serving in the Garfield administration. I'm sorry. So they have the convention. It goes on and on and on and on. It's like the longest convention ever. I don't know who times these things, but that's what I read. And so they get to like the 35th ballot. None of these candidates are even close to having the required number of votes in order to win.
Okay.
So it's Blaine and Sherman, John Sherman, who was William Tecumseh Sherman's brother. All these people are all mixed in here. So they throw their weight behind Garfield. They see him as a dark horse candidate. And he had made some speeches, and he was sort of known, but he just served in the House of Representatives before he became president. So that's sort of the background you have that sets all this up. And so he does this front porch campaign where he doesn't, because of course you didn't go out and campaign. If you were the person, people came to you. You had other people go out and campaign for you.
How things have changed.
We mentioned that too, and in that different podcast when we were talking about this, how you didn't do it. So he did win, and so he became president in 1880, inaugurated. I think at that time was still March 1881, and then on July 2nd, that's when he's shot.
So his approval ratings seemed like they were quite low. So okay, so we had the guy that shot him. What was his name again? It was
Charles Guiteau, which is actually kind of it sounds like guitar, but
yeah,
that's what I always think of.
And so it took 4 or 5 months of this guy who thinks he was integral to getting Garfield elected.
Right.
And he's upset and he shoots him. And is that why?
Yes. In fact, there is this is the great thing about this era. I know we keep talking about it, and we'll change that up a little bit, but all these great cartoons they would make. And so one is this Guiteau, he's holding a gun in one hand, and in the other hand he's got a sheet that says something like rejected office seeker or something. And people really glommed onto this. Now, Guiteau had his own problems. He had these sort of, like I said, he had these delusions of grandeur, that he was the one. And he did see Garfield. They did meet face to face, because he would always hang out at the White House until he became kind of a nuisance, and he had a confrontation with James Blaine, who had become Secretary of State, because he kept thinking, I want the consulship in Paris, and because his name was French, but he was born in Illinois, so and he wanted all these high offices, and they really couldn't give that to him, and so he nurses this grudge. And so in June, the whole month of June, he followed Garfield around town. But he was going to do it in June when he was at the railroad station, the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. But he didn't, because Lucretia Garfield, that was Garfield's wife, she was with him. And he thought, well, this will upset her if I do this in front of her. So he
like killing her husband wouldn't upset her.
Wouldn't have done it anyway, exactly. And so he didn't do it then. And I think it's one of those situations where if just one little thing would have been different, this might not have happened. So he was going to meet his wife in New Jersey for a summer vacation, because it got so hot in Washington, D.C. in the summer. As if you've ever been there in the summer, I was, but it's pretty humid and hot, So
like kind of Midwesty in that sense?
Yes. And so July 2nd, he goes to the Baltimore Potomac Railroad Station with James Blaine. Now, luckily, Blaine wasn't shot, which given that Blaine had a confrontation with Guiteau, he knew who he was. I think Guiteau sort of did it because he didn't think he'd have another chance. So he ended up shooting him in the back. He walked up behind Garfield, he shot once, it grazed off his shoulder, but unfortunately the second shot is the one that went home. And Garfield fell, and of course there's commotion. People jump on Guiteau, they're starting to beat the heck out of him.
Nice try, nice one there, nice save.
Yes, So and there's a lot of chaos, of course. Anytime there's chaos, there's things that get missed, there's things that get lost in the shuffle. But what really makes this kind of interesting is, so now you have Guiteau, he's in custody, probably beaten half senseless at some point, but he's in custody, they've got him, and he's yelling, I am a stalwart, I am a stalwart. Arthur will be president now. Arthur will be president. I did it. I want to be arrested. Now, the Arthur he's talking about is Chester Arthur, who was the vice president.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Chester Arthur was a stalwart, and he was, some thought he was a creature, that's what they always use the word creature, of a senator named Roscoe Conkling, who was a senator from New York, who controlled all this stuff. Well, the problem you have now is you have somebody who just shot the president, basically jumping up and down saying, look at me, I'm a stalwart. And Arthur is going to be president now.
Oh, so it seemed like it made this sound like a conspiracy of some sort.
Yes. Now, there's never been any proof that Arthur ever knew this Guiteau at all. It's never come to light. In fact, Arthur himself knew how this looked. Today we use the word optics. Well, these optics were about as terrible as they could get.
Yeah, no, like that's one of those things. And now we'd have, even with social media and all that, you can never know the origins of all the things. You have to go through so many hoops just to find out. And I'm thinking, we're in the late 1800s. That's
Right.
going to be even harder.
In fact, I remember I was watching a documentary on this, and Arthur, they always have these sort of recreations or whatever, reenactments. And Arthur gets out of a carriage in New York City, and they ask him, hey, what do you think about the president? He had no idea. But of course, he immediately knows what this means, because now people think he's complicit in this crime, along with Conklin and all these other stalwarts.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not. So he has to go like into hiding, because people are kind of after his hide, because they think he's the one who ordered this.
Yeah, and apparently it's not hard to shoot a president at this point in time.
No, that's a good point too, because presidents didn't have guards or Secret Service. Lincoln had guards, but that's because it was the Civil War.
Yeah.
I mean, Guiteau had all kinds of interactions with President Garfield.
And to be that close, because guns weren't as accurate.
Right. In fact, he didn't know how to use a gun. He had borrowed money to buy a gun, and he bought a pistol. And so he would go out into the woods and practice with it, leading up to this. But he also said God had told him to shoot the president. So you can kind of see where this is going. Mm-hmm. It's not going well. And so Garfield, in the hubbub that was going on at the train station, Robert Todd Lincoln happened to be at the train station as well. He was Garfield's Secretary of Defense. And Robert Todd Lincoln has I don't want to say privilege, because it really wasn't, of being present at 3 assassinations of the 4 presidents. His father, yep. Lincoln, Garfield, and he was actually outside the building in 1901 when President McKinley was assassinated. And everyone always thought, did he ever say anything about that? Because it seemed like such a weird coincidence that he would be at these 3. He did actually, and this is his quote. I found it, and he, after this, he was later given a presidential invitation to come visit. And he said, no, I'm not going, and they'd better not ask me, because there is a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present.
Yeah, you kind of got to hand it to them, like, he knows.
And he also made when Garfield was assassinated, or shot at least, he was still alive then, he also made the remark about how Washington, D.C. was just a town of sorrow for him. Mm-hmm. Because given what happened to his father. Now, he wasn't at Ford's Theater that night when Lincoln was shot, but he was at the White House and rushed right over when he heard. So he had that wasn't really a pleasure either. And Garfield, it's so funny because Garfield was a little like Lincoln, not totally, but he was from a very poor family. He had sort of raised himself up through self-education. He had gone to college. He went to a Baptist seminary, not seminary, but a Baptist academy of some kind, or college. And he started out there doing odd jobs because he needed the money, but by his 2nd or 3rd year, they had made him a professor because he was so smart. And so I think with some of these characters, especially in this time period, the late 19th century, we kind of get lost in the shuffle because we don't know much about them.
Yeah.
They're just guys with long beards. Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, even Ulysses Grant. But we're learning more about Grant's presidency all the time now. And maybe for good reason. They were Benjamin Harrison, who really, in fact, sometimes I forget he was president. But Robert Todd Lincoln did something that, ironically, he had gotten a doctor named Willard Bliss. And this is where the story gets interesting. Well, but this is where it takes on these kind of tragic proportions, because Willard Bliss was a doctor, and the only reason I think Lincoln remembered him is because he was at Abraham Lincoln's deathbed and trying to treat him. And so, but Bliss is the one people blame for Garfield's death. It wasn't the bullet, because later when they did the autopsy, the bullet missed all the major organs. Okay. It had gone into his back, and it had come to rest on the left side of his body behind the pancreas. Now, I know the pancreas is on the right side, so I was trying to figure this out. So I had one of our, but it was on the left side, so it must have been somewhere in the center. It wasn't on the right side. So I had one of our staff members stand up because I was trying to figure out this path.
Oh my
I was working on this Friday. I said, just stand there with your back to me. I'm not going to just stand there. I've got to visualize this. I'm getting confused, you know.
You couldn't go to Google Images. You had to grab one of your staff.
Someone said, and of course, what was funny is she said, "Are you doing this for your podcast?" I said, "Yeah, I am." For science, or that's always what they say. We're doing it for science. So, of course, at this time, you have the old medical establishment, and it's clashing with the younger doctors who believe in the sort of germ theory of disease, and Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur.
Yeah, reasonably so, yeah.
Right. And now the problem with Willard Bliss is he didn't believe in this. And the reason he didn't accept it was because he was kicked out of some society in Washington, D.C., there was this society of doctors, and he was expelled from it because he believed in homeopathic medicine. And he said, you know what? I won't make that mistake again by going for some newfangled medical theory. Because listen, the last time I did it, I got thrown out of this medical society because they thought I was a crank or they thought I was a quack. I mean, he also got expelled because he disagreed with, and to his credit, he also got expelled because he disagreed with the society's blatant racism and its exclusion of black doctors in its ranks. Mm-hmm. So there was that. I mean, he wasn't all bad, I guess. But that's another reason, because he was an outspoken critic of their exclusionary policies.
Yeah.
So he doesn't believe in this. So of course, when the doctors, and when he arrived on the scene, he kind of said he took over, and he was giving orders, and he was doing this, and he spoke with such confidence. Someone said that we thought he was the family's doctor, so we backed off just because of his presence. Well, that wasn't the truth. And so, of course, everyone sticks their hands in the president after he's shot. And in fact, somebody punctured his liver because they had reached in there looking for the bullet.
Whoa.
But the mistake they were making is when they would go through the back, and I hope this isn't getting too graphic for people, but when they were doing this through the back, they would go to the rightward looking for the bullet when it was on the left.
Yeah, because you'd think everything's flipped.
Yes, so they were going the wrong direction, so all they did was create another channel for bacteria to go in.
And this is so early. I wonder how their disinfecting practices are at this point.
Probably none.
Yeah,
I would say. So he takes over, and what he does is he starts limiting who can see the president. He says, well, it's because I don't want him disturbed and all this. No, what it is he's trying to control the whole thing, and he's sending out all this stuff to the press. He's sending out press releases, and he's saying, the president's doing good. He's doing great. Meanwhile, Garfield's sitting there filling up with infection and slowly dying, and his organs are going to shut down. But he's saying out all these, and this is why when it happened, when Garfield passed away, the heavens opened and it all fell on him. Mm-hmm. Because they thought, well, wait, you were telling us that he was doing great. And there has to be a reason. So he would give Garfield all these different things, but nothing seemed to be working. Well, that's because Garfield was getting an infection from the bullet. And it wasn't unheard of. In fact, some would argue, and I read this book, I have this book called Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard, and it's about his assassination at Garfield's. It's very interesting because she makes that point too, that all these people were involved in his care, and none of them, everyone was looking at his wounds. And yes, I understand when Lincoln was shot, they did the same thing, but Lincoln's shot was mortal. I mean, that was to the head.
Yeah.
And at that time, Joseph Lister didn't really start doing his thing until about the mid-1860s, so it still was not known. By this time, it's kind of known. And so some doctors were like, well, we could have just, he could have saved him. He didn't have to die. And so, but yeah, so she argues, and other doctors at the time have argued, that people at that time lived with bullets in them. I think one time we mentioned Andrew Jackson in one of the podcasts.
Oh yeah.
He walked around with like 3 bullets in him. And after the Civil War, these soldiers all walked around with bullets in them that didn't seem to do any harm. They didn't have to take it out. In fact, the detective that took Guiteau to the Washington, D.C. jail, he had a bullet in his head from the Civil War, but he didn't seem any worse for the wear for it. So a lot of them thought, well, if he was just, if it wasn't the president of the United States, if it was just some guy in the Bowery in New York City, here we go, New York City again, in the Bowery.
Got to keep it in each one.
They would have just sent him to Bellevue Hospital and then just sent him on his way, because they wouldn't have been doing all that probing and all this stuff.
They're like covered in a Band-Aid and say good luck.
Pretty much.
Whatever keeps 10 people from touching the wound or opening a new hole,
That's what they did with the probes.
Oh, God.
And you can imagine how much Garfield's suffering here. He can't do anything. And he was a young man. He was 49. It's not like... And he had young kids, too.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes on for like the whole summer. They try to rig up things in the White House to cool it down, like having something blow over ice because it's so hot. But his condition, and we are, sometimes I talk about, when I talk to some of my people I work with, and they know I'll talk about this stuff just off the top of my head, but I always wondered about, medicine shows. And I always think of this because they were giving Garfield this sort of mixture of alcohol and opium and quinine, which was weird to me because quinine's for malaria.
That's an interesting combo.
But I was like, well, of course he probably wasn't going to feel any pain. And I always said that with medicine shows. Someone would show up and say, hey, take Doc Scott's elixir here. It'll help your toothache, your backache, every ache you have. Well, of course it will. If it's filled with alcohol and drugs, you're probably not going to feel anything.
You're not going to feel. Someone could probably cut their arm off with that.
and it's not helping his condition. They even tried to, and then he couldn't keep down food, and it just was really bad. And meanwhile, this Dr. Bliss, he's tightening the reins on everything. So they had a family doctor named Jedediah Baxter. So he showed up. He was immediately got in some big confrontation with this Bliss because he could see what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And Bliss sort of banished him and said, well, no, I'm not going to let you disturb the president. That was always his thing, And then Lucretia Garfield, she got her own doctor, a woman named Susan Edson. She was like one of the first female doctors in the country. So she arrived. She was also shunted off. And so they were all relegated to kind of nursing duties, but what they agreed to stay because they wanted to make sure that when Lucretia Garfield wasn't there, someone was there that would represent her interest.
And so there was like a doctor could just take someone like that.
That's apparently what happened.
Because I'm thinking of nowadays, you have a critical injury, sure, there might be the emergency doctor at the time, but as soon as it's possible, everything is going to go off to your main doctor. And that wasn't really...
Right, and Bliss was telling everybody in the press that he was there at the behest of the Garfield family, which was never true.
Wow.
That was not true at all. And so he had such a tight rein when people were trying to, it practically came to fisticuffs, but then Baxter had backed off because he didn't want to disturb the president, because you still have that going on. And so, because he can see that none of the things they're doing is working and that this is getting worse. This is a situation that's getting a ton worse. And Bliss would even write letters to people, and he'd underline sentences in his letters that say, I can't have the president die. He would underline each word. So he knew, because, it'd always be, it'll hurt my career. And
as if it wasn't hurting already.
Oh, it will hurt. It'll get there.
So yeah, were there repercussions for this? Because there's no way that Bliss just got away, because it's not like he was, I guess, not a crime, but...
It wasn't a crime, but his reputation suffered terribly after this, and I think he kind of just sort of retired from doctoring.
Retired
with air quotes, which we're doing again with you all the time. but
retired there, okay.
And so Garfield's getting bad, and they want to get him out of Washington, D.C. So some New York millionaire says, well, I have this mansion in New Jersey. Ironically, I think it's near Long Branch where he was going originally. You can go there, you get and a lot of people went there because of the breezes, off the ocean. Mm-hmm. And so he went, and Garfield ended up passing away on September 19th. So he lived 79 days in this condition.
Oh, that's terrible.
And the repercussions weren't good because as soon as it ended, there were a lot of things that ended. The spoil system was over so one of the things that Chester Arthur did, he totally changed how people thought he'd be president. He had this falling out Roscoe Conklin. He was his own person. And he passed civil service reform like Garfield wanted. And it was called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. I know it sounds so petty, but these offices were so lucrative, that's what people were just going crazy for them. And if you didn't have spoil systems, you had to actually earn the office instead of whatever, just getting it for helping somebody, And it got even more contentious because after this, Bliss presented Congress with a bill for like $26,000 saying, hey, that's what it would cost if this is all the business I lost because I spent all my time with the president. And all these other doctors said, well, I want in on this too. And then you had people who had hung curtains in the White House to blacken out the room for Garfield. They were submitting bills to Congress, and finally Congress said, this is out of hand. None of you are getting anything. And the public really reacted against that kind of thing. And they also reacted against the spoil system. Mm-hmm. And Chester Arthur, he came out okay. He was kind of forgiven because he wasn't a creature of Roscoe Conklin, and he did do his own thing. Now he only served out the one term, and he knew he wouldn't win a second term. And he died like 2 years after he left office in 1884.
That's a good call.
So he got okay. He got out okay. So, but there's this little biography by an author named Ira Rutkow, and it's just called James Garfield. It's part of the American President series. But it's like one of the best president's biographies I've ever read because he spends like half of it talking about Grant's medical care. And not only is Rutkow a historian, but he's also a doctor.
Ooh.
And he's also a clinical professor of surgery. And that's the first time I ever encountered this, was reading this book. I knew he was assassinated, but I didn't know all the sort of ins and outs of it.
Yeah, it wasn't like, he's going to die in 2 days. It was
79 days.
79 days of attempted medical care.
And even there were some doctors now who tried to defend some of the care, but even doctors then didn't defend it. Mm-hmm. The younger ones. There was a doctor named Frank Baker who had just got out of medical school. He actually drew a diagram and he said, "Oh, I bet you I bet you the bullet's here," and he was right. He just based on what he was reading. But and then I just want to mention quick that Alexander Graham Bell was actually called in because he had invented a metal detector. So they thought, well, why don't we run it? And he had this idea: why don't we run it along the president's body because it'll go off. But Bliss would only allow him to do the right side because he was convinced the bullet was on the right side, not on the left. And if you do it on the left and it goes beep, 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 well, there goes Bliss because you're proving him wrong.
Well, could we have a medical malpractice suit at this point in time for Bliss? Just going back a hundred years or so.
Right. So it is interesting because I know people say, well, that was medicine then. Well, it sort of was and it wasn't. And even the doctors then weren't in agreement. And so that's what you have. And that's why it's always been interesting because, when the other presidents were shot, they pretty much expired when they were shot. But that's why this was so much attention drawn to this because it was a drawn out. And some people even thought Bliss was trying to manipulate the stock market in some way by sending out these positive messages instead of the negative ones. Now, that's never been proven. That was just something that people would say. So, yeah, so that's why there was so much involved in this. And it was the end of the stalwarts, too. The stalwarts were in bad shape after that. And Guiteau was executed in June of 1880.
Oh, he was executed. Wow.
And he argued, just one last point, and what he argued was, I didn't kill the president. I shot him, and he claimed insanity. But his medical care killed him. Mm-hmm. I didn't. Well, he was executed in June of 1882 because that didn't work. But I found it interesting that even he used that in his defense, that the doctors killed him, not him. He admitted to the shooting, but never to killing the president. So.
Wow. I don't think that'll hold up.
No,
it didn't hold up.
They even sent out invitations to his execution because I've seen a picture of one.
Wow. Wow. Like that might take in the cake for the most interesting assassination I've heard, because that's just not even. Well, I mean, that's a.
And it's even more tragic to think that if he didn't have to die, and he's such a young man too.
Yeah.
It's like, boy.
Wow. So Scott,
Uh-huh.
where are we going? Where are we cruising? What's a preview? What we're cruising through next
Well, I
week?
thought that we'd get out of the 19th century because I seem to go there all the time because it's so interesting.
Okay.
But I thought maybe next time we look at the Harlem Renaissance.
Okay. I'm liking this.
Yeah, and we can kind of have you can kind of jump in too if you like. So.
Oh no, the history in me isn't there, but I'm looking forward to what we get to
Right.
talk about.
So okay, that's